Welcome to Storied, the untold Jewish stories behind your favorite music. Season 1, The Beatles. This project started off as a live show created in partnership with the Berman Theater at the J Detroit, and has grown exponentially since then, including shows about other bands and other genres. Now we're doing this podcast where in each episode we're going to dive deep into the history and the legacy of most of our favorite band, and that is the Beatles, focusing on where Jews and the Jewish community contributed and collaborated to their stardom. Each episode begins with a recording from our live show telling a quick and high-level version of the story, followed by this episode, this deep dive really getting into it, as I interview some really special guests. It's no secret Jewish events today can be appropriately hard. We have some serious issues that we're grappling with as a community, and they often require a box of tissues and a therapy appointment afterwards. The Storied live show was conceived and developed at the J in Detroit in partnership with the Berman Theater, not as the answer to this problem, but as an answer to this problem. We are focused on a positive narrative, Jewish joy, and reminding people about the great contributions made by the Jewish community. We're excited to see Storied grow with this podcast and many more live shows. Now, you may be here because you're a Beatles fan, or you may be here because you're looking for positive Jewish content. In either case, our intent is for all of your delight. And I think you're going to get there. If you're watching this on YouTube, you see this awesome Storied shirt that I'm wearing, and it was designed and made by a sponsor of the show, Yonatees. Now, Yonatees makes awesome custom merch and some really great Jewish-themed merch, like the ones you're seeing popping up on the screen here. If you're listening on an audio feed, pop over to YouTube just to see what I'm showing you, because it's worth it, and I think you're going to like it. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, we would love to talk to you. Check out the links in the story notes, including our website, www.storied.show, for more information about who we are, what we do, the other bands and genres we've covered, or how we can bring this live show to your city. If you like what we've done here, please leave us a review and maybe some stars. If you have any questions, hit us up on our socials. We'd love to hear from you. All the links, again, are in the show notes. And with that, let's get this show on the long and winding road. Welcome to episode 4 of Storied, and man, am I excited for you to hear what we've got going on today. First off, Happy New Year to everybody in the Jewish community who celebrated Rosh Hashanah last week. You'll notice that we didn't have an episode last week, but now we have a solid 11-week run from episode 4 through episode 14, and it's going to be pretty spectacular. Today we're talking about Cousin Brucie and Murray the K, two characters who are almost like the megaphones that amplified Beatlemania from England across the pond over into the United States. These guys were magic. They were characters. They were totally outlandish. So much so that it's hard to compare them to today's current cast of media personalities. They were really that different. And we've got a really special guest with us today. His name is Lee Trink. Lee is a music executive. He was the president of Capitol Records. Not when the Beatles were there, but the same Capitol Records that was the Beatles record company in the United States. He's also a music executive in general. And interestingly enough, there are people that we talked about in the second Storied show, which you guys may not know about yet. It's about grunge, and season 2 of the podcast is going to be about grunge. And Lee worked with those folks. Lee was in the music business during that time, and he still is. And so we have a long conversation about STP or Stone Temple Pilots. We talk about Kid Rock. We talk about all sorts of really great 90s and 2000s music personalities. This story is really special because when you look at Murray the K and you look at Cousin Brucie, they weren't part of the Beatles organization. At the same time, they weren't just standing on the sidelines. They were cheering on. They were encouraging. They weren't contributing to the band. They were contributing to the zeitgeist. And that is really beautiful. And then Lee and I get into some of the Jewish advocacy and Jewish community topics that are really relevant today. And we talk about some real complicated stuff. But I want your feedback. I want to know what you think. I want to know what you think of Lee's conversation. So while I was thrilled with the insights that Lee brought to the conversation, and honestly grateful that he was willing to spend an hour with me. So hit us up. I want to know what you think. So now let's get this podcast episode in your ears and in your eyes and under these blue suburban skies. And I'll sit and meanwhile back in.
When it comes to the early days of Beatlemania in America, there are two names that stand out. Number one is Cousin Brucie, and number two is Murray the K. These were legendary DJs who played a crucial role in catapulting the Beatles into stardom. First, let's talk about Cousin Brucie. According to legend, he received the first Beatles record, I Want to Hold Your Hand, from an armed security guard, and it was handcuffed to his wrist in an attache case. At 8:58 p.m., Cousin Brucie was instructed not to play the record until 9, and when he did, it automatically went out to 40 states through syndication. And he immediately knew that he had something special on his hands, and he played it 8 times in a row. Most people were going crazy, and they were loving it, and he kept going. But like many stories in this era, there's some conflicting versions, and some people say that Cousin Brucie wasn't the first person to play them, and he wasn't the first person who had them on the air in America. Even if he wasn't, there's no doubt that he was the most influential and most powerful person who put them on the air. So even if somebody did it a few days before him, he's the one who put them on the map in the United States. Within a few days of that initial broadcast, every DJ in America was playing the Beatles, and one of Cousin Brucie's main competitors, Murray the K, stepped up to join the craze. Murray was another larger-than-life personality. He was actually a champion of Bob Dylan during his controversial transition to electric guitar. At a 1965 concert at Forest Hills Tennis Stadium, Murray introduced Dylan to a chorus of boos and people pretty angry at him. I can't even imagine. Famously declaring, "It's not rock, it's not folk, it's a new thing, it's called Dylan." So when the Beatles arrived to New York on February 7th of 1964, Murray somehow managed to sneak into the Plaza Hotel and score the first in-person interview with the band in the United States. From that moment on, he was a part of their inner circle. Murray accompanied the band on their first U.S. concert in Washington, D.C. He was backstage at their historic Ed Sullivan Show premiere. He even roomed with George Harrison in Miami, broadcasting his nightly shows from their hotel room. Now, while Murray claimed that George Harrison bestowed the fifth Beatle title upon him during the train ride to Washington, D.C., folklore suggests that that's BS, and he actually gave the name to himself. But either way, the name didn't stick. Nobody called him that. It was generally Brian Epstein who really held that title, and some people refer to George, though. Now, I've got a few recordings of Murray the K interviewing the band. If you check out the Storied Instagram, you will see some of those recordings. They're really wonderful.
Okay, here we are, episode 4 with Lee Trink. It's good to have you here. Thank you for joining us, Lee.
Great to be here with you, Benji. Good to
I
see you as
appreciate it.
always.
Yeah, you too. Building friendships with people like you is one of the silver linings of the sort of post-October 7th world, where I got into the Jewish community advocacy and talking about our people in a way that I wasn't beforehand. So, I'm grateful for the ability to reach out to you. Let's jump into it, because this is an interesting story from the Beatles side as well as from you as a guest side. So the story is about Cousin Brucie and Murray the K, and these two guys who, when I try to talk to even my daughter, who's 15, she's about to turn 16 next week, and I try to describe, like, why would a radio personality be so important in culture? And I'm like, imagine Howard Stern meets Joe Rogan. And she's like, oh yeah, that's an important cultural conversation. But she would never
It's actually
understand it.
it's a perfect analogy, right? Because, radio personalities these days really don't have nearly the influence that they have historically.
Right.
But a podcaster like Joe Rogan, on its face, you can understand, okay, he controls so much of an audience, has such an outsized voice. And, forget about now when there is a tremendous amount of competition around attention. Back then, there was not that much attention. So we were much more of a monoculture back then. So
Right.
people like that was like, like Joe Rogan times 10, is the kind of outsized influence just DJs had at that point on the culture.
Right, because we have 1,000 television and XM and Sirius radio stations and podcasts. Back then, there were four. There
Social
were four
media and
stations, and that was it.
yeah, right on.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild. So their influence and ability to reach is interesting because cousin Brucie. I don't want to say claims, but the folklore is that he was the first person to play "I Want to Hold Your Hand" on American radio. And then, like everything, it's disputed. Well, he wasn't the first. Somebody played it a week before. Maybe he wasn't. And it's like, okay, let's pretend he wasn't the first. He was definitely the most influential, and he had the
Yeah,
biggest reach. And that scene of him playing the song 8 times in a row and then
right.
immediately being it syndicated, it's like, oh, he amplified this across the pond in a way that nobody else could.
Yeah, very, very much so. Right. As again, kind of the unusual influence they had, including the ability to play what they wanted to play. Right. Like, now and even for many years, there were program directors who designated what these guys played. But back then, they were able to directly influence culture by just making the decision of what to play. And obviously making a statement like, I'm going to play it 8 times in a row almost defies logic. Like it's kind of like, you know, what you would think a teenager does in their bedroom with it with the with the new hot song.
Right.
But they would do it in a much more of back when that era and for quite some time was a very much of a push era where again those outsized voices were able to make a decision of curating what it was and push that out to a massive number of people, where now most people are accustomed to a pull culture where you're sifting through literally the entire catalog of music history at your fingertips through
Right.
Spotify.
Right. It's one of the great challenges that I have. I grew up between Gen X and Millennial, where like I grew up analog and then, became an adult digitally. And, I remember buying albums to listen to albums. And then even my younger siblings like streamed albums to listen to songs, and the difference between, I look at Zeppelin albums. Physical Graffiti is an album. You don't listen to a song from Physical Graffiti. You listen to Physical Graffiti. You don't listen to a song from Abbey Road. You listen to Abbey Road, and there's certain albums that are just like that today, but back then everything was like that. That was,
Well,
that was the
well, also
idea.
the way the medium worked back then, you designed an album and you had the opportunity, because if you think about like, let's call it the friction built into vinyl as a medium. If you wanted to skip a song, you had to get up from wherever you're sitting, walk over to the turntable, very gently pick up the needle, and even more gently drop it into the song that you want. It's like it's like defies logic for people
Right.
today, which are just kind of like skip, 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 and or shuffle and whatever it is. Like if you think about that, the barrier to skip a song was immense back
Right.
then.
Right.
And
It's so
and I
funny.
actually think it's it's a subject that I've thought about and I've talked about in a number of different ways, in the impact of that. It forces you to actually listen to songs that don't necessarily hit your ears in a certain way immediately. And I think that what we've lost as a result of having the easy skip is that sometimes kind of opening your mind requires more patience and maybe kind of suffering through a song once or twice. What I would even say personally, when I think about kind of my favorite artists, it is often the song that I did not like at first that became my favorite song.
Mm,
That's almost like an impossibility these days to
right.
achieve something like that.
Right. You have like 3 seconds to grab people's attention, and if it's not,
Yeah,
it's
which
not there,
which
they
think
move
about
on.
that. So think about the pressure on an artist to kind of be reductive in their songwriting that like almost like pushes you towards the lowest common denominator to reach the most amount of people in the shortest amount of time, and like what kind of almost like the antithesis of what the creative kind of adventure is.
Right. I've never thought about it in the music writing capacity. I think about it in the social media capacity, right? Like you have those first couple of seconds and that's it. But like whether you're talking about Pink Floyd or the Grateful Dead or Fish, where it could take 3 minutes before the song gets into the song, you're just in an intro to the song for the first few minutes, as opposed to, you know, the definitely the early pop stuff of the Beatles, and even so in the later where they just hit you right in the face with it. And that's an interesting, I never thought of it for that perspective. So I'm glad you have this experience and ability to talk about this, because one of the things I wanted to dive into deeper was Murray the K, who's a fascinating character in general. But one of his sort of claims to fame was that he snuck into the Plaza Hotel. He got these interviews with the Beatles, but then he went on the road and he was actually broadcasting and recording his shows from George Harrison's hotel room. So like bringing the equipment with him, which today is no big deal. My laptop, a microphone, like I could do this easily from anywhere.
From your phone.
But back then from my, yeah. You know, but the ability to do that in 1964, can you talk about what a monumental challenge and you know, what a big deal it was that he was able to do this?
Well, yeah. So I would almost say two things. So the challenge, obviously, that's like that's kind of a one-time thought of how do I take a studio on the road, right? Like how do I crack that code? And he figured out to do it. But now think about it from the audience's perspective, who have never consumed things like that, like in kind of real time out in the field. Like you're maybe used to a newscaster being somewhere and telling a story, but something where he's following around a band, telling a story in real time in a breadth of interviews. Like that didn't exist back then because of the barrier, because of the technical barrier of recording and broadcasting and all that. And so, you know, there's always the flip side. Whatever the technical constraint on the front end means that the audience is not consuming that in general. And so when you can tackle that first part, that second part is all of a sudden something like earth shattering. And that was also at an era, you know, unlike today. Like today, you know, like, you know, again, I'm not in the music business anymore, but I always kind of lament, you know, the evolution and the changes and the things that we've lost. And one of the things that we've lost is the mystery around a lot of artists, because people didn't have so much access because of all technical reasons and the constraints around how much broadcast, how much, you know, how many radio stations, the fact they were local. And so something like that is really groundbreaking at the time and almost more akin to what you'd experience now from an artist than back then, when you barely got to hear a peep, you barely got to hear a word from your favorite artist. In you know, it was much rarer.
Right. Right. It was all interviews, suits and ties, you know, behind a table. And this was not just on trains, it was in hotel rooms. And that's unheard of. And today people post daily from their hotel rooms, from their bedrooms.
Right.
And
they're right. Live streaming every day, all day, and very often.
Right. The whole, like, you know, get ready with me. People are like making videos while they're putting on makeup and describing the news, you know, while they're putting on makeup. It's a different world.
Yeah.
Actually, episode 10 of this podcast is going to be about Akiva Nof. And I'm not sure if you are familiar with his story, but he was a journalist, a Jewish journalist in the Netherlands in the 60s, and he went to John and Yoko's bed-in and did this interview in the bed and really got much deeper than the wall of reporters that John and Yoko had let in, and really had these intimate conversations. And there's some amazing recordings of the three of them talking. And again, it's just like, oh my God, you know, you just don't get to see that in general. These intimate moments are really impressive. Well, as mentioned in the intro, one of the amazing things about you is that you were the president of Capitol Records. And this sort of gives you an ability to talk about two things. Number one, the Beatles and the Capitol Records world, but also season 2 of the podcast, which is going to be about grunge. And I'm gonna punt that to later. I got 1,000 questions to ask you that are just like appetizers for what we'll talk about in season 2. But Capitol Records had a huge fingerprint on this same Beatlemania being brought across the pond because they owned the release of the music. And I was reading some of the stats, and I don't understand all the intricacies, but they were able to sort of rebrand some of the albums. They made 11 American albums out of 7 British releases, out of 7 UK releases. They changed some of the track listings, they changed some of the artwork. But can you talk about, like, from the halls of Capitol Records, what does that look like? Is that a notch on the belt, or is that a hallway or an entire floor of the building?
So, you know, I would say that is controversial from an historic perspective. It is, there was tension around that between Capitol Records and the band and management. I'll start with, let's say, and a not an uncommon story. And the beginning of it was Capitol in the US was actually not so stoked about the Beatles. And it took them a minute before Capitol proper actually decided to release a single and the record. It had, Capitol it had the rights to EMI Music. They kind of pushed it off, some of the early tracks, to some of the lesser known labels. And then finally, I think there was kind of it came to a head of, either you guys are going to do this or we've got to go figure out something else. And then almost begrudgingly, or certainly with a lot of skepticism in the front end, Capitol decided, okay, we're going to do it. Interestingly, considering that they were skeptical, they ended up making a huge marketing push. They spent something like 40 grand on I Want to Hold Your Hand, which was an astronomical figure at the time. And, but there's also some of the other controversy, right? Because of rights that, I mean, frankly, rights like that don't exist. They didn't exist in my time, with maybe rare exception, where a label unilaterally could do with whatever they want and whack up a record and change art and whatever. Like that's so anathema to the business for so much time, right? Like, it just shows you, again, like, there's a lot of the era that I was in the music business where artists had dramatically more control than the Beatles did in their era, even despite their popularity. That's actually only increased. Artist control has only increased over time. I have kind of an unusual perspective because I spent a big chunk of my career on the record label side and also a big chunk on the artist manager side. So I kind of can, lever between, with philosophically, like I can put on the different hats and tell you what the merits are and what the dangers or the ills are of that. And, I would say the fact that Capitol did it, they they might have been wrong, they might have been right, but they delivered the results as far as making the Beatles a phenomenon in America. Now,
Right.
could that have happened if they released it as it was? Maybe, probably, maybe not as quick. It might not have been, there, like, even you're mentioning Cousin Brucie. I think that the leak of that song was, there was an initial leak of the song to a Washington DC station, and
Right.
then they had to, like, accelerate. Like, remember, it wasn't now where you hit a button and you send it to everybody who needs it. You have to ship vinyl to these places and you're timing it. So all of a sudden they had to scramble. And but arguably, but for that leak, they wouldn't have been number one before their Ed Sullivan appearance. And so, I tend to be obsessed with the story of how an artist breaks, because it's been such a cornerstone of my career were breaking artists. Like it was just something I've done, probably a dozen plus times, taking an artist from unknown to, gold, platinum, plus, plus, plus. So I tend to be fascinated by how did it happen, and always, pontificating on like what maybe was what was the secret sauce, and what did it, and what didn't. But the proof is in the pudding, and they became huge. But the band is in their right to be pissed off at taking what they see as a body of work and cutting it up. It's not like you don't take a Picasso and just say, you know what, we're going to focus on the bullhead and we're just going to make that into one giant bullhead, because people can't
Right.
process all the rest of this, this crazy, perspective. Right. So again, I see it from both sides, but ultimately I would say my heart always lands with the artist. I think the artist should be in control of their art. But there's
Right.
tension between, wanting the art in its pure form with how do you introduce it to a population, and introduce it to people in a way that you're going to be able to get the job done. And, there's certainly at that time, through most of my time, like there was no science at all to it. There was
Right.
very little data up until recently that you could utilize in order to actually help you. It was like the entire business was run on gut check, which is kind of
Right.
wild.
Right. That's incredible. And it feels like, speaking of gut check, it feels like it's one of those like success has many fathers and failure's a lonely orphan, right? So it
Oh,
worked. So the Beatles take credit for it being these great albums. Capitol Records takes credit for it being released the way that they released it. And if it didn't work, they'd both point the finger at the other one.
well,
Right?
that's always. I mean, they wrote those songs, they recorded that songs. If anything, it's 99% on them. You know, would they have gotten there one way or another? Is their talent so undeniable that like come hell or high water, it was going to happen? I would say probably, maybe, right? Because it's really
Yeah.
like that. Like, because
Yeah.
I'll also tell you from personal experience that there are artists that I loved, and not only loved, and not only thought they were brilliant, like brilliant. I remember like th- this always sticks out of me. There was an artist I had called Faraz, he's still around, and he wrote a brilliant record, like really groundbreaking, like in the realm of like a modern Elton John. And I remember talking to it. We had a curated group of maybe like 30 people that came to hear him play. And I said, we're going to talk about this day. We are going to talk about being in this room, listening to Faraz play this song, after he wins the Grammy, after. And it didn't work, and nobody knows who he is barely. Made that all the more painful was we were promoting him and kind of working on that record at the same time as Katy Perry, and they were like best friends. And both of them were huge priorities for us, different lanes completely, but you know, one became, the Katy Perry that is known worldwide, and we were able to get that done. And with the same motivation to get it done with Faraz, nobody knows who he is.
Right. Well, I wrote down his name, and I'm going to be listening to his music this evening
It's
as I'm.
yeah, it's this first album is gorgeous. I mean, it's stunning.
Yeah. I
I mean, it's called Aliens and Rainbows is the record.
Well, I'm gonna overshare with you, if I may, about Katy Perry. So,
Sure.
despite how cool I look, I've never gone into the world of Katy Perry. Prior to a couple of years ago, I was asked at the beginning of the pandemic if I would host a music hour for young adults with special needs on Zoom for Friendship Circle International. And I was like, I got literally nothing better to do, and I'm happy to participate. My daughter participates in Friendship Circle, and so I hosted this music hour, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do, so I was just like, anybody got any requests? And kids just started yelling songs out at me, and it was a combination of like Lion King and Little Mermaid and Johnny Cash and and Led Zeppelin. Like it was a wild mix of songs. So I still do that. It's every Friday afternoon. I get on
Cool.
Zoom and we do this music hour, and kids will request songs that I've never heard of. And so now I have a deep roster of Katy Perry and Shawn Mendes, like all these songs that were just not in my wheelhouse, but these kids are asking for it. And very often I'll say, hey, I don't know that song, but I'm going to learn it and come back next week and we're going to play that song next week. And so I've actually very much come to appreciate Katy Perry and some wonderful songs. And yeah, she's a regular in our rotation. There's probably 250 songs that are sort of, maybe there's probably 40 songs that are in a regular rotation, and then another 120 songs that are in somewhat rotation, and we cycle through. It's a ton of fun. So I figured as a Katy Perry fan, you might appreciate Firework, and yeah, we do a lot with her. So tell me about the Beatles in your world, both personally as a music fan and as a music executive. Like, what are some of your favorite Beatles stories and sort of, behind the scenes, or, oh, nobody's heard this one, or very few people know this story? Like, give us some of those.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously the Beatles were well before my era. And so, it, being at the helm of Capitol Records, you obviously have them within your historic roster and your current roster. But the reality is the stories that I would say, a lot of the stories I know are stories that are out there, right? Like I don't know that there there are that are any like hidden gems around that. Look, I'll actually give a confession. Like I'm actually not. I hadn't been the biggest Beatles fan in general. I appreciated what they did, but for me, I think one of the things that actually changed that for me a lot was the documentary, the more recent documentary.
Apple.
Um, yeah, that's I think it's like a 9-hour documentary.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like 3 3-hour episodes. And if to me, and part of my appreciation was not just as a music fan, but as a music executive who has made a lot of records and put out a lot of records and understand the dynamic. So what I not only appreciated, what I was mind blown around that was, and they film everything, right? They literally filmed the entire process. I don't know. I think they say how many, hundreds of hours of footage that they actually recorded, because they just like recorded everything all day, and
Yep.
they weren't shooting that much. But to me, what was amazing is when they made that record, there was already chatter about them being over, right? I think that there's something interesting. Like when you think about kind of the toxicity of media now, it's also not new, right? So you had
Right.
all these media outlets already kind of like the headline was, "Are the Beatles done?" And and so the pressure for your next record in the face of that is monumental. They walk into the studio and they have, I think, like 3 weeks or 3.5 weeks to write the record and record the record. But what's even more insane, they make the bizarre, and this is when they didn't have a manager anymore. They were self-managed, which is already like a recipe for disaster. Self-management is I would say, is a disaster for almost every artist. Um, but they make the decision, they've got to write it, record it, and be able to play it live, because their idea is they're going to do a show, and the show is going to be the recording. So you don't have to like, and just because you write it And just because you record it, it doesn't mean you're prepared to play it live. Those are three very distinct skills that you need to develop. And
Right.
you've got to learn it enough that you have to remember all the lyrics, remember all the chord changes, remember of something that you just did. So the amount of pressure on doing something like that is beyond the pale. Like, honestly, I don't think I've ever had to put out a record under that level of strain. And so, you know, and they walk in with almost no ideas. And the thing that I was really mind blown about, and why I watched it twice, again, as a not so much of a Beatles fan, especially before and afterwards, I became much more of a fan. But like, to sit there and be flying a wall and all of a sudden start to hear the moment that they craft some of the most seminal songs in the history of recorded music
Mhm.
was earth shattering to me. And again, with it, for me, I felt that pressure as they're like marking off the days that they've got to do it, right? Like, they're marking off the calendar in this thing. And, you know, and you just, like, McCartney is just fooling around, and all of a sudden you hear those first notes that you don't have to be such a big fan to know those first
Right.
notes of Let It
Right.
Be, of like
Right.
and it's
He's like,
I was awestruck. I was
yeah. When
really awestruck.
he's like, I have it at a C, but let's move it to a B sharp. Like,
Yeah, and then
yeah.
you're like, oh, what the?
Uh,
It to see that in real time. Like, look, I've spent plenty of time in the studio where you kind of see things happen, and like, it's amazing. But like, knowing the historic context and seeing
yeah.
that in real time was earth shattering for me.
So you're describing what floats my boat, for lack of a better, like, you're describing what I enjoy about music and what I enjoy about the process. So, like, the whole idea of Storied is this VH1 Storytellers meets MTV Unplugged experience, where we're talking about the songs, we're talking about the behind the scenes stuff, we're talking about the things that got them going, and how pivotal were these, what could have otherwise been inconsequential things, that really rocketed them forward. Obviously, a video of John and Paul and George and Ringo is very different than me talking about it. But
Yeah,
yeah, your being enamored is par for the course for my experience. That
yeah,
is the fun stuff. I love that. So, all right, let's talk about you mentioned you were part of the branding and the launch of numerous bands. Can you talk about some of those bands, some of the household names that people here would know, and then I'll get into
yeah.
my
So
pinpointing of
so
some of those.
so maybe I'll tell you the story almost. I'll tell you this. I'll try and make it brief, but I'll tell you the story of the first artist that I ever played a real role in breaking, almost like defined my career at the beginning of my career. But I'm going to tell it backwards, because
Okay.
I want to give a window into almost the chaos and the, like, kind of almost like a corollary to this Farah story of like, nobody knows anything. Like, the real punchline of all of it is nobody knows anything. And one of the things I always say is, like, people who are great in the music business, I had a great track record. I had a very successful career. I broke a lot of artists. I did very well. And I usually say this in the context of when when somebody wants me to give them opinion about a song, and maybe I'm not enamored with it. What I say is, hey, look, I may have had a great run, but that means I was wrong 70% of the time, because it's like a baseball hitter. And if you bat 300 in the music business, you are at the top of the echelon.
Right.
That's really it. Like, you can bat 100 and be successful. Batting 300, you're cranking. So,
Right.
I was brand new. I was at Atlantic Records. Somebody played me a demo of this track, of this artist. I went bananas. I was brand new. I didn't know anything. I didn't know really what I was even supposed to do. But I decided, I said, I'm going to put my heart and soul into it. I'd actually asked my boss if I could work on this record. It had been assigned to somebody else. And she said, oh yeah, go for it. Which I didn't really understand. The reason why she gave it to me, I was brand new, was they weren't planning on supporting the record at all. There was no budget for it. It was never on the discussion, list. They didn't care. She hated this artist, hated the artist, and they planned on doing nothing for the artist. So what better in giving it to the new guy who, if he screws it up, well, no, nothing lost. And, and not only that, the whole label hated this artist. They just for a number of different reasons, which maybe when I tell you who it is, it'll become a little more apparent. But really, it was like a small group of like 5 of us who really believed like almost religiously that we were going to put this thing on our back. We were going to crack the code and we were going to do it. And frankly, I'm pretty sure that if the artist didn't break, I would have been fired because I made such a nuisance of myself. Like I would wait, like we used to do these like weekly meetings where there'd be like 40, 50 people in a room run by the head of the label. I'm just like a junior nudnik, and the artist would never be on the list. So I would wait for like a pregnant pause in the room and launch into a conversation about the artist, trying to get people to pay attention, and frequently got my head cut off in the room by people more senior than me.
I love the
Almost like I
chutzpah.
didn't. So the punchline of it is we sold 14 million copies of that record. It was Kid Rock, who years later I went on to manage him. I managed him for about 7 years later on, and we're still close. But that was my first taste of, partially, you don't need to know. I didn't know anything. And I just did what made sense to me. As I said back then, which I think is a lesson in general, I would address the elephant in the room to some people, including, Rock as an artist. I said, I would say to him and other people, that it was important to. I would say, you've heard of out of the box thinking, and I would say, I don't even have a box. Like I don't even know what the box is.
Right.
And I've used that to my success in a number of different ways. It taught me a lot of things. People who purport to know things, they don't necessarily know things. And sometimes you just gotta, trust your own gut and fight for the things that you believe in. And if you do that, you're much more likely to be successful more frequently than listening to somebody else. Because the truth of the matter is, all the so-called experts, they don't know what the hell they're doing either.
Right.
But most experts, it's also different when you're in the position where you need to make the call or not. Being a supporting role, like being a supporting character, is very different than making the call. Like when it's your, obviously it was not my call to make at that time, but when it is your call, that's also another thing. Easy to
Right.
Monday morning quarterback, easy to
Right.
critique, hard to be in the chair.
Right. Can you tell me about your relationship with STP and how you advance them, and I'm going to tell you why that is an important part of the story here.
So this was also when I was at Atlantic Records. This was after I probably had like 2 successes under my belt. Also, like the second one was a dark horse candidate. Also, most of my successes were dark horse candidates. But they gave me an STP record to work on. I was already a fan, so that was really fun for me. That I got a chance to work with the guys, get to know them. It was under like really challenging circumstances because the band delivered the album the day Scott Weiland went to jail. Like they literally that day where I think he served, forgot how long his sentence was. But that was a challenging environment to promote an album without the singer, but it was number four. The album is called Number Four,
I was
and
just going to ask you which album we're talking about.
yeah. And again, I was a big fan of those first three records. So it was a cool experience, and I got to be actually quite close with the guys, and even Scott. I had a very nice relationship with Scott, who, as most people know, unfortunately passed away. But really nice guys, like guys I related to. Yeah.
Yeah. So, by the way, when they toured after releasing the album Number Four, I saw them here in Detroit with the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and those were I remember the guys that I went with, and those were great shows. So
By
the
the way,
reason
that's
I
where
bring up
I Kid Rock in the State Theater. That's
in
back
this,
when he
sure,
was playing. Detroit was the only market where he had any fans.
yeah,
That was another piece of the story. Like, he had three failed records
right,
before we had success with that record.
right, right. That was the Ba with
Which
the
is
Ba
all
record,
that. Yeah, exactly.
right? Yeah. So obviously, being in Detroit, he's a fan favorite around here, and he sells out stadiums multiple nights in a row. And actually, I'm a fan of the Tony Hinchcliffe podcast, and he's on there every once in a while, and so he can take a punch and he can give it, and he's good like that. So after we did the Beatles show here in Detroit the first time at the beginning of 2000 or 2024, people were like, okay, what's next? And I'm like, I got to lean into what I know, right? And so I did a show about grunge, and it was 22 songs, whereas 22 stories and 22 songs, whereas that's almost double what I did with the Beatles. The Beatles was 14 stories and 14 songs. But the way that I was able to lay it out was the first set was about Jews who contributed to the scene, and the second set was Jews in the scene. So, Jews in the scene were Darcy Retke from the Smashing Pumpkins and Alanis Morissette and Adam from Counting Crows. Those were Jews in the scene, whereas Jews who contributed were stories like Atlantic Records being founded by Ahmet Erkan and Herbert Abramson. And I talked about this, this odd couple, right? This people who shouldn't mix but came together for business and pleasure and something that they loved and created something unique. And that's how we got to STP. And it was the only story where I was like, I feel like I'm cheating, right? Like, I don't have a good story. I tried really hard to find something, but I couldn't do this show without including STP. And I was like, okay, the Atlantic Records story will be the STP story. And I kind of shoehorned it in there. And I don't feel guilty about that at all. It is there. But the good news is that the next time I do the grunge story, it's Atlantic Records, Ahmet, Herbert, and Lee. And that's the STP story. So I'm really grateful for that.
That puts me in very good company.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about Jewish community sort of advocacy that's going on in the world, or the advocacy that's necessary that's going on in the world, in guys like you and me, and how we met, talking about the insanity that's out there, and anti-Semitism, and very much, I don't want to say based, but forward in the music scene, and your ability to speak to people who should be our allies because we were their allies, and people who should be our allies because they're otherwise liberal-minded, passionate and compassionate people who are siding with, terror and really, oppressive cultures. Tell me. I mean, you can say it more eloquent than most, so go for it.
I don't know if it'll be eloquent, what I'll say, it might be more brutal than eloquent, but I think the reality is, and it's not just music, it's the entertainment business, I think, is made up of a tremendous amount of cowards. That may sound harsh, but it's also accurate. And there is a fair bit of cowardice in the face of being criticized for, you know, let's say things that don't seem popular on its face. I think there's also the entertainment business is certainly mostly, populated with progressives. And I think the other dynamic, and, I've had a number of conversations in the last 2 weeks about this subject matter, in that, you know, despite being considered progressive, there is very little room for opposition thought. And so it's a lot of groupthink. It's a lot of the orthodoxy that you see coming from progressives, even within the Jewish community. Like, you know, people will say, well, the Jews run the music business, or the Jews run this. And by the way, tons of Jews in the entertainment business, partially because it was mostly Jews who created these industries, period, full stop. The film business, the music business, created largely by Ahmed is almost an exception, to the landscape of who created the music business. On the film side, it's almost exclusively dominated by Jews who invented what this current business is. So that's why we started it. We're here. That being said, we do not enjoy some type of outsized pro-Jewish or Zionist voice within those communities, because even amongst those Jews, I don't want to be, I was about to say, I don't want to be overly political, but I guess I got to speak my mind. It's the progressive Jews are more progressive than they are Jewish. And, this is something I think for us to diagnose and comment about more broadly. Why is that phenomenon? What is it that too many Jews will subjugate their own safety in favor of progressive ideals? I actually don't think they're progressive. I think a lot of this stuff is very illiberal. I think when you cannot even listen to a contrary opinion, and if you have to, like, not allow opposition thought to even sit in front of you, that is tremendously illiberal as an idea, but it is common. And I would say, even amongst Jews, they don't necessarily want to hear it. And I think it's one of the things that we're up against. And it's so bad. Like, I'll tell you, one of the part of the conversations I've had over the last 2 weeks was in the wake of the Charlie Kirk murder. And a lot of people reached out to me, even people that I hadn't heard from in a long time. And what they expressed is their inability to speak up in the circles of the entertainment business. If they have any viewpoint that at all steps outside of the very rigid orthodoxy of what is acceptable, conversation, and what's not acceptable.
Right.
It's really sad.
Well, I got to say two things on that. Number one, when you say, like, the Jewish community created these industries, I think it's an important note to say that the Jewish community created these industries because we weren't allowed in other industries. And so we created an environment where we could make a living, right? So from Broadway to film to music, there were people who were creatives who couldn't get jobs in theaters, and so they started their own theater companies, and that's how those started. And then when they looked for lawyers wouldn't represent them, so Jewish lawyers who couldn't get into other law firms were like, we'll start a law firm, we'll represent the entertainment industry, and now we have Jewish agents and Jewish law firms and Jewish accounting firms.
We might have to bring that back, unfortunately.
Right. I mean, it's crazy. The other thing that I'll say is I think that this is not a new thing, especially in the last 2 years, but you mentioned Charlie Kirk's murder. The idea that in the horseshoe curve, in the horseshoe theory, right, a centrist is looked at as an extremist by either side of the extremism boggles my mind. And I'm a centrist through and through. I have left-leaning thoughts, I have right-leaning thoughts, I have centrist. I really believe that bigger tents with bigger doors and bigger tables is the way that we're going to get through this. And when I say those things, extremists on the right call me a fanatical liberal, and extremists on the left call me a right-wing bootlicker. And I'm like, literally, this is what centrism is, and the inability to, as you said, see a opposition think like that. It doesn't make sense.
You get as much criticism
understand
from the right as from the left in the delta of your opinion. Really?
Not on this subject, but in the subjects that we're talking about over the last 2 years, I did a post about some of the stuff that we did for Rosh Hashanah, and how we're going to get into the Jewish stuff now, right? But I talked about how I'm an atheist. I participate in Jewish community and Jewish ritual for my kids, for my wife, for my family, because I want my kids to have positive Jewish experiences. But my kids don't like fish. And so rather than having a fish head on a table, I buy a box of Swedish fish and we eat candy, right? And then I was like, well, if I'm doing that, let's get some gummy bears and have, show pride for the bear Jews, and all the bear Jews should be strong this year. And, I just made a bunch of goofy, fun, right? Like, you're smiling and laughing. Like, that's what I want my kids to do when they think about Jewish rituals. I want them to have a positive Jewish experience. And I posted about that, and somebody was like, that's what's wrong with you liberal Jews, you American liberals. And, you think you just change things because you want them different. And I'm like, dude, leave me alone. Like, if you don't want to do that, you don't have to. Why does my having Swedish fish on the table bother you? And he's like, you're making stuff up. And I'm like, all right, well, pinpoint when apples and honey showed up on the table, because it wasn't 2,000 years ago,
Yeah.
Like, give me a break. And like, that's one example of many, but over the course of the last 2 years, I have found just as much pushback from the far right as I have from the far left in being a centrist. And that's okay. It reinforces my centrism, right? Like, it shows me why it's so important, because if that's offensive to you, we need more of that. We need to desensitize you to this offense. It's insanity.
Yeah.
So
agree with that.
all right. I end the show by talking about why I do this and asking you a couple of questions. So, in this post-October 7th world, I found that Jewish community events were hard, appropriately hard, right? We're grappling with some difficult issues. I say, sometimes you go to Jewish events and you need a box of tissues and a therapy appointment afterwards, right? And so my drive for doing this, in talking about Jewish collaboration contribution, is to focus on the Jewish joy. Focus on the happy stuff. Focus on where we can get back to talking about Swedish fish and smile about, oh, that's a funny home game custom. When you hear the words collaboration and contribution, and think about Jewish community, what are some of the great contributions? What are some of the great collaborations that you think about in today's world?
I think it's actually challenging to pick some out. And I think this is, it's part of what's so disappointing for me, and I think most Jews who are aware of the contributions that we make anywhere from medicine, technology, music, film, philosophy, like, is there any corner? Like, I'm trying to think, like maybe sports we don't over index on, although we do have
We're-
some sports legends. We do have Sandy Koufax and Mark Spitz, and there's probably some others that I'm not
Hank Aaron.
remembering. What's that?
Hank Aaron.
Hank? Oh, was Hank Aaron? I didn't know Hank Aaron was Jewish. Okay, there you go. See,
I'm
learn
gonna
something
feel
new every
stupid.
day.
I'm gonna Google it right now as we're talking.
But the reality is, we over index everywhere we choose to play it. If we want to apply ourselves into some space, we will excel. Period. Full stop. That's it. And so it's so disappointing to hear all of the, it's probably that part is probably where I'm most disappointed in the woke right, in the way the woke right criticizes, right? They're the woke right and the woke left criticize Jews kind of differently, even though they sort of can team up. But it's what's so disingenuous about it when you look at really the contributions, the hard data. Forget about any of the subjective things. The hard data around what Jews have contributed. Jews have made this world a dramatically better place to live for everybody, period.
Amen.
And that's and then the next part of that is the message to Jews of, it's time to stop kind of underplaying that, because that keep your head down and go along your business and go do well and keep it moving has not served us. And so I think we need to be less apologetic, less sort of low key about um, our massive and ongoing contributions to this world. And I would take the I was going to say the Pepsi challenge, which sort of dates me, right? The Pepsi challenge doesn't, but like, I would go toe to toe, Jews versus name somebody else, name another thing, and then go pick a field. Again,
Right.
maybe sports is the only one where we are, and we probably don't under index at the very least. I mean, we probably over index because we're such a small population that we still over index, but we don't dominate like we dominate in so many other fields.
Right. I need to clarify that Hank Aaron was not Jewish. I don't know where I pulled that. I showed my lack of sports knowledge, but even without that,
I
do know
Jewish, who's never gets to, that we never talk about. Even I don't know that he practiced, is Elvis.
Yeah.
Elvis's mother was Jewish.
Yep. 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 So the first time I did the Beatles show, and when I mentioned that Brian Epstein said to John Lennon and George and Paul, he said to the crew, he said, if you hire me to be your manager, I'll make you bigger than Elvis. And Lennon said, I don't believe that you can do that, but I want the person who manages us to believe that they can. And somebody from the audience called out and was like, Elvis was Jewish. And so
that's funny.
Yeah. All right. The second part of the question is, when I say the words Jewish joy, what is Jewish joy in your life? What does that look like?
I think, well, in my life, or what is that kind of, how do I
in
view
your
that?
life? And in your life, some people say it's, singing Jewish songs with their kids, and some people say it's, all sorts of different stuff, Friday night dinner with the family, like whatever that looks like. I want to know what Jewish experiences that make you smile.
I might answer this question differently than you suggested. Like, my kind of newfound, very outward, very kind of vehement promotion of Judaism and Jewish people and Jewish ideas is really only a post-October 7th ideology for me.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, it felt maybe inconsequential is overstates it, but it just didn't feel important or necessary or even a big part of like how I looked at myself and how I looked at Jews. It just didn't. I was Jewish. I was always culturally Jewish, not very religious. But it was never a big part of my life. Other than my family life, maybe. It was more connected to my family life, but my own outside of my family, not really much at all. And it unlocked in me the urgency around Jewish joy and a celebration of my own Judaism and other Jews and Jewish history and Israel and all things related and connected to Judaism. So when you say Jewish joy to me, it's very much attached to, in a way, it's the way I fight back is really, again, I'm trying to articulate what I'm saying. So it's not like they're almost, my Jewish joy is in counterbalance to the people who wish to silence me and us and our collective Judaism. And
If I can
so
put words,
it is
if I can put
almost like
words in your mouth,
they have forced me to weaponize my joy.
yeah. If I can put words in your mouth, the shirt that I'm wearing, empower Jews, right? And that idea that being a strong and proud and powerful Jew is a part of Jewish joy for you. And I think
right.
what you said about, this not being a priority prior to October 7th is very much part of my story. This was not something that I focused on at all prior to October 7th. But I'll tell you, there's something special that I have found in other people showing pride in stuff that I didn't care about or stuff that I don't even necessarily believe in. Right? I'm not religious. I'm an atheist Jew. I'm very culturally Jewish, but I don't believe in the dogma and the religion. And you see, I remember last year when they had the encampments on the college campuses, and I think it was Chabad of USC posted a video. They were putting tefillin on students in front of the encampment, and they even put tefillin on students who were in the encampment, and they said, "Hey, we don't care. Jew is a Jew, and this is what we're doing. We're putting tefillin on people." And I was so proud of that. That was so great. And I don't know if you know Eitan Levine, Eitan the goalie on Instagram. He's got a new organization called Tribe NIL, where they're just empowering Jewish athletes. Speaking of Jewish athletes, they're empowering Jewish student athletes to just show pride and be supported by the community just for the fact that they're Jewish athletes. And, they're getting hated on in the locker rooms. They're getting hated on the field. They're getting hated on in the classroom. And okay, well, join Tribe NIL and just be supported by virtue of the fact that you're a Jewish student athlete. And we, as responsible adults in the Jewish community, want to support you for that. I love that. I think it's so important today. And, if we lose the 15 to 25-year-olds, we're never going to get them back. And so those moments are so important.
Yeah, I think the good news is we're going to see, like, there will be the younger Jews who get silenced and kind of will shirk back, but the other Jews that don't do that are going to be some badass Jews. Like it's the classic, you know, tough times make strong men, and tough times for Jews make strong Jews.
Yep.
I think, when I see some of those, like we're friends with some of the outspoken community that are in college or just out of college, whether it's like a Tessa Wexler or a Shabbos Kestenbaum, like those they're animals. They're animals. And
in a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. Yeah, I say, yeah, like, you know, they're beasts in like what they do, and like I think I think that is also the unintended consequence of the pressure against us.
Right. Right. And when you think about, you know, when you think about like the grandchildren and the great grandchildren of survivors standing up
Yeah.
and showing that strength, right? Chavez was a liberal, you know, Democrat, far
Dump
left, you know, out
Bernie.
there. Yeah, you know, he was the and he's like, hey man, I'm a political orphan, not because I don't believe in these values, but because you made the space literally unsafe for me. And that's a problem. And, you know, his ability to not cower and go out and say these things eloquently and talk about them and win lawsuits and win crowds over when speaking in front of them. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah,
It's a beautiful thing.
agreed.
So, okay. We've reached our hour. Lee, thank you so much for being here. You are the first of, I don't know how many, but you are the first person who I know for certain is going to be on multiple seasons of Storied. I can't wait to have you back for the grunge conversations, because I know that we will. And I'm very much appreciative that you were here. So thank you.
Thanks for
Thank you
having
for being here.
Fun
Absolutely. We'll talk
conversation.
soon. Yep.
All right, brother.
Bye.
Good.
That's our show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe and leave us a review. It helps the algorithm show other people this podcast. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, again, reach out. We would love to talk to you. And make sure you check out the show notes for the links to our socials and our sponsors. This show was produced by Ryan Storm from This Is Storm Sound. Editing done by Andrea Rizzuto. Production management done by Eric Nelson. Booking by Leanne Deutsch of 16 Mile Talent. Design work done by Tessa Hewitt. Research done by Avishai Bauman. Now, the music you heard is recorded by Evan Sherman, but was actually written by my late father, Rabbi Yossel Rosenzweig, as the original opening of the song that he wrote for the Diaspora Yeshiva band called Pit Huli. I'm your host and storyteller, Benji Rosenzweig, and this has been another episode of Storied, the untold Jewish stories behind your favorite music, Season 1, The Beatles.